After being diagnosed with anxiety shortly after the birth of her last baby, Sarah Reade felt shame and isolation. As she began to open up about her struggles, she realized that mental illness is not uncommon, it's just not talked about. So she began to open up about her struggles as a way to help others see that they were not alone. Here's Sarah with This is the Face of Mental Illness.
My name is Sarah. I was born in Kansas City, raised in Hutchinson in a typical American family. I graduated from high school here and Kansas State University. I earned a degree in elementary education and married my high school sweetheart. Now I stay home with our 3 children, and I have a mental illness. The face of mental illness is not always what you think, and by all accounts, I had no reason to be ill. My life is as normal as you could wish for. No childhood trauma or history of abusive behaviors, no addictions, no financial stressors, no diagnosed family history, and no chronic medical conditions. But I was 4 weeks postpartum after delivering our 3rd baby, Jackson, when I was struck with debilitating anxiety, panic attacks, and intrusive thoughts. I remember taking this picture and wondering how I was going to care for this little baby and his siblings when I was afraid to get off the couch. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling, but I knew I was not well. It was a holiday weekend, and I knew it would be several days before I could talk to my doctor, so I started doing some research, Googling my symptoms, trying to make sure I was not alone in what I was feeling, because it felt so unnatural. It was such a relief when I came across the symptoms of postpartum anxiety disorder, and I found that I had nearly all of the symptoms. It started with an overwhelming feeling that someone was going to take the baby, that I couldn't give him to anyone else because what if something happened? But I couldn't be left alone with him because what if something happened when no one was with us? My muscles felt tight, but also exhausted. My thoughts were racing constantly. There was an overwhelming feeling of dread. I made it through the weekend and sent a text to my doctor. She saw me right away. As hard as it was, I was honest with her about how I was feeling. We talked for a long time. She was empathetic. She told me I was not alone, that almost as many women suffered from postpartum anxiety as do postpartum depression. She gave me hope, and then she gave me a prescription for Zoloft. It took 4 weeks for the Zoloft to start working. It felt like the longest 4 weeks of my life. I spent most of those 4 weeks in my home with my kids nearby. The baby slept on me for every nap, and keeping him close out of any perceived danger was the only way I felt I could make it through the day. I was no longer the mom that had it all together, the Pinterest mom doing all the crafts and all of the baking. I couldn't even pretend that I had myself together anymore, even though I pretended plenty before my diagnosis. The stress and anxiety showed on my face. You could hear it in my voice, and I hated it. It wasn't until the Zoloft kicked in and I began to feel more like myself that I started telling a few people outside of my close family exactly what I was going through. It was hard at first. There was shame attached to the diagnosis. There was shame attached to the medicine. And more than anything, I was afraid that they would see me differently. I was on a walk with a close friend when I opened up for the first time. We loaded the kids up in strollers, and as we were making our way through the neighborhood, I told her I was struggling. I told her I had postpartum anxiety and that I was on medication and that it made my life more difficult. But I was hesitant to tell her everything. My hesitation only made it harder. I started relying heavily on experiences of others. I didn't personally know anyone who had struggled with postpartum anxiety, so I searched out blogs, Facebook communities, Instagram accounts, anything that would help me see that I was not alone and what I was experiencing was also something that others had lived through. It wasn't long before I realized that anxiety was not a topic that was talked about much, even though anxiety disorders are the most common mental illnesses in the United States. I began to feel the push to share my story in a more intentional, more public way, to really be vulnerable in the hopes that others would not feel the shame and isolation I did. 4 months after my initial diagnosis, I took the first step towards being more vulnerable. I shared a website called Postpartum Progress on my personal Facebook page. This was the website where I first found my symptoms of postpartum anxiety, the website that helped me feel like I was not alone, that there was a light on the other side of these overwhelming feelings, and that asking for help was completely okay. It was hard to hit post on that first post. My heart was racing as I shared a snippet of my experience, as I let my friends, family, and acquaintances know that my life was not as easy or normal as I made it seem on social media. But it felt so important to let others know that they were not alone and that they had an ally in the fight. I was sure someone else would need this resource. The post was well received, but it was nearly a year before I started to seriously sharing my experiences in a public way. That year gave me time to heal a bit more, time for my bleeding wounds to be transformed into beautiful scars, time for me to get a better perspective on what it was like living with an mental illness and how I could best help others. It started with simple posts, simple hashtags, graphics to let others know that they were not alone in their struggles, but I was guarding my heart, guarding the hard memories, guarding the image that others had of me. This felt safe and easy, but still helpful. What I didn't realize is that opening my heart, I could heal just as much as I would help. Brene Brown said that owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. I was beginning to see the power of my light, the power of sharing my experiences with the world. I began to open up more through my Facebook posts on Facebook. The social media platform gets a bad rap for being negative, but I wanted to use it for good. I wanted to use it to bring an end to the stigma and the shame that I felt when I was diagnosed. I talk about the medication I take. I talk about the trips to the therapist. I talk about how I took care of myself. I talked about how mental illness can make life harder, but we are not weaker because of it. I wanted to let others know that it was okay to seek out help, to talk to their friends, to talk to their doctors about what they are experiencing. I wanted them to know that I would be there to talk with them when and if they felt comfortable, that I would not judge their experiences or their struggles, and perhaps most importantly, that it was okay to not be okay. As I began to put words to the feelings, to really be vulnerable, I began to see that sharing my experiences gave others a different perspective on mental illness. It gave them a peek inside the life of someone who struggled. It gave them a story they could relate to. It gave them a voice. And in giving others a voice, we are breaking the stigma on mental illness, one story at a time.